Good afternoon. It's great to be here and have this opportunity to distill 200 pages of love down into 15 minutes. So want to go ahead and throw something out there. So this is a public service announcement. I speak two languages. I speak English and I speak Southern. You're going to hear a lot of Southern. If you need translation after this, Mike said he'd be happy to do that at the social. So let's talk about mergers and acquisitions and the role of collective leadership capability in that. First factoid, 40 to 80% of mergers and acquisitions fail to meet stated objectives. So if you take that to heart, there is an immense amount of risk involved in mergers and acquisitions, and I think it's really great that Daniel Rasmus was before me, because I'm going to ask you to look at my model through my eyes and my perspective. So your first mental model that you might have about mergers and acquisitions is this: the big fish eating the little fish. So show of hands, how many of you have been the little fish? Okay, I see a few. How many of you have been the big fish? Okay, more. How many of you have been the big fish that turned into the little fish? Yeah, okay, so we got more of those as well. So we've all lived through this. Very highly volatile, complex, and ambiguous events that take place that really drive inorganic growth for many organizations, and why they want to focus on these things as a potential area for them to grow. One of the things that really came out of the research as I looked at it is the fact that mergers and acquisitions fail to meet stated objectives, not because of business skills of individuals, but because of the lack of leadership and change management skills. And I think that's kind of relevant as you look at what the big talent consulting firms, the big consulting firms, and as well as others look at with mergers and acquisitions. These things have been sliced and diced so many ways as people look for that holy grail to try to mitigate that risk. They've looked at cross-border mergers as a reason for success or failure. We've looked at capability matches, industry sector matches. So all of these things trying to determine what is it that drives the success or the failure of a merger or acquisition. And so that's led to some initial or more focus on the human factors that really drive successful mergers and acquisitions. And as you look at this word map, what really kind of strikes me is that you don't see anything up here about human factors, with the exception of this one word, management. But you don't even see leadership up here as one of those critical factors. And I think one of the things that has drawn me towards this topic was there was a lack of research around leadership in successful mergers and acquisitions. Sure, lots of academics talked about it. They spent time talking about people skills, but there had been no quantification of what that meant and how you could leverage that information to try to mitigate the risk as you went through this process. The one study that really drove me to follow on this was from Egon Zehnder, which is a talent consulting firm, and McKinsey, called Return on Leadership, where they looked at leadership competencies of the top 25% of companies in growth versus the bottom 25% of companies in growth. And what came out of this is what you would expect. Those companies in the top 25% of growth around mergers and acquisitions had greater leadership capabilities in these 3 leadership areas and these 6 leadership competencies specifically. But what it didn't tell you was the whole picture. So it gave that opportunity to try and open this up and share additional insights. So these two guys got it. Carlos Ghosn, who is currently the CEO of Nissan Renault and the Nissan Renault Alliance, and Jean-Pierre Gagné of GlaxoSmithKline. So what they did is they realized that even on paper, what the analysts will tell you is that these mergers look like surefire winners. They're going to achieve the results that we're looking for and the goals that we're looking for, but the reality is that something always caused them not to work. And Jean-Pierre noted that it was usually the people part of it that was the problem. And particularly with Carlos Ghosn, so when he went to Nissan, Nissan had been in 10 years of decline, no profitability at all. When Ghosn went into Nissan, he specifically started to work at building transparency and how he was going to change the organization, how he started to build relationships with middle managers in the organization, and how he was going to leverage the learning between Renault and Nissan to bring it back to profitability in his change management plan. And we'll come back to this shortly. So what this context gave me were these three critical questions that I wanted to know in my research. What leadership areas predict M&A success? What are the leadership competencies within these leadership areas that predict M&A success? And then additionally, what is the role of senior executives versus middle management in successful mergers and acquisitions? Because what the research said was that senior executives are the end-all to be-all. They're the ones making the decisions. They're the ones that get all the credit. They're also all the ones that get all the blame for these things. So it was an area that we really wanted to take a look at. So with that context, I looked at 94 mergers and acquisitions between 2004 and 2008. This covered the time period when merger and acquisition activity was at its height, particularly in 2007 when it totaled nearly $4 trillion globally, as well as it captured some of what happened in the financial crisis of 2008 as we saw less merger acquisition activity over that period. We looked at data sets, two separate data sets for acquirers and target companies. That represented from 360 assessments, and I think I can say this. So I partnered with PDI Ninth House, which is a Korn Ferry company now. So Korn Ferry, wherever you are, we will pony up at the bar later this evening. Acquirers, we had over 18,000 360 assessments representing 173,000 different inputs on leadership capabilities. For targets, a little over 2,000 representing 22,000 views into leadership. These also covered anywhere from individual contributors in these organizations all the way up to the CXO level of the organization. Now, the first thing that struck me was that target companies, on average, had way fewer 360 assessments than the acquirer did. And this is of significance for future research, I think, because understanding your own collective leadership capability is important if you're going to be able to make decisions about how the business is supposed to work. Because my perspective is, it doesn't matter what your production or your marketing or your sales capabilities are, without world-class leadership capability, it would be for nothing. So we looked at 4 leadership areas: thought, with sound judgment, thinking strategically, innovation, and providing direction as the competencies there; results, with focus on customer needs, managing execution, driving for results, and establishing plans; people, including influence, motivate, and developing others and building relationships; and finally, personal, which included acting with integrity and showing adaptability. So this was the results of the model based on these leadership competencies in this set of mergers and acquisitions. So for acquirers, thought, results, and people leadership areas predicted M&A success. For targets, only thought. Now, the interesting piece are what competencies actually predicted M&A success in these cases. So for acquirers, it was focus on customer needs, motivate, influence, develop others, build relationships, act with integrity, and show adaptability. Now, here's the key piece about this. You notice thought is on there, but there were no thought leadership competencies that made the list. So what came of this is that the group of leadership competencies by themselves, when they are aggregated, actually predicted M&A success, but no one thought leadership competency predicted M&A success. The other big point from the research was this: it's all about the people and the personal, specifically with acquirers. And if you think back to Carlos Ghosn, so he was working to be transparent in how he dealt with the organization. So he was acting with integrity and building trust. He was learning, or sought to help the organization learn from each other, so the develop others was present. And then he was building these relationships in the organization as he went forward with middle managers, senior executives between Nissan and Renault. So he got this. The other piece you have to realize is that these build on each other. So if you don't have trust and integrity in an organization as you go forward with a merger acquisition, there's no way you're going to be able to build relationships. And if you're unable to build relationships, it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to motivate and influence people in that organization to do the right thing, to get on board with the merger and the change activity that's involved. For targets, it was around provide direction, motivate others, influence others, and build relationships. And the real key to this one for these 4 competencies for targets really revolved around senior executives were more effective in successful M&As for the acquirers, but for targets, it was really middle management that drove the success of the merger acquisition. So middle managers that were able to build relationships, influence workers, and motivate them in order to be successful in the organization in the midst of this major change with all this volatility and uncertainty. So really interesting results from that. Now, what does it all mean? So let's think to the HR due diligence process. Normal HR due diligence process looks at things like what's the pay and benefits, what training do they have, what workplace relations issues are going to bite us in the butt from a legal perspective. The reality is we need to shift focus to a different area with HR due diligence. By knowing your own leadership capability and knowing the leadership capability of the target company, you can start to mitigate risk and understand where you are going to have challenges with that merger acquisition specifically. The second one, collective leadership capability in the aggregate. We work in a lot of organizations where individual leaders are what we focus on. We give them the assessments, we help them get better, but what we tend to not do is aggregate those results so we have an idea of what it is that is working in the organization. And what this research points out is that you need to understand that not only of yourself, but also of the organization that you're looking to acquire in order to mitigate that risk that we talked about and try to make this successful and shift that focus from a 40 to 80% failure rate to more like an 80% success rate. And finally, identification of deep talent. So what the research told us as senior executives, that top level is what we should focus on. When you go into a target company, that's who you're assessing to see which one of them you're going to keep in the organization. What this research tells us is we need to go deeper. We need to go as deep in the organization as possible, get access to that data, and identify these middle managers deep in the organization that can help us build the relationships, motivate the employees, and make this a success for all of us. So with that, thank you.